First, any queries, questions, comments on what we did yesterday? So, what we did for people who were not here yesterday is a kind of an overview of what we understand by English language education, and we looked at the history, the different kinds of passageways, pathways through which English language education passed. We also generally looked at a history of education in general in the West, not so much in the what we call the global South today. So, we haven't looked at that, but we also made a detour through Indian language education systems, etc. And then we stopped at the colonial times when English was really introduced in a very formal fashion in South Asia, but I also mentioned, so there are lots of, the moment we talk about English education, the point that I was trying to make was that we will need to keep in mind that there are always exceptions to the rule. So, if we, for example, say that colonial education introduced English, that may not be completely true, okay, because there were other instances of English education, for example, missionary education, that happened much before the colonial empire was established in India. So, I think those kind of exceptions need to be kept in mind, because they kind of influence each other or overlap with each other. Just to tell you a story, and then we will come back to your comments and queries. In fact, there was a big shall we say fight between the colonial administrators and missionary educators at the beginning of the 19th century, because the colonial administrators wanted to control education, okay, over a period of time. They thought that the missionary educators had more control of education than they had. So, what was getting taught in the classroom, etc., etc. There was also a political angle to it, because remember, early colonization was also a bit scared of meddling into, for example, Hindu beliefs or Muslim beliefs or Buddhist beliefs, etc. And they thought that what missionary education was doing was kind of meddling into these affairs, okay? And therefore, they wanted the missionaries to keep their hands off education. Okay? So, these kind of debates are very common during this period. So, English education is a rough pathway. It is not really something that we can say that it began here and ended here, okay? Because there are lots of digressions. So, it is not a linear curve if you are from science. It is more of a curve which goes like this. So, it is a spiked curve all the time. Yeah? And I think that is the point that I was trying to make yesterday. Any comments, any questions or clarifications that? Okay, if it comes to your head, please do stop me and ask in between. Today what we are going to do is we are going to come to the what we call the brass tacks of English language education. Okay? Now, as I told you yesterday, that what happened as English started getting introduced in these large countries, which were often bigger than the mother country, UK, there were problems of how do you teach English in a classroom, okay? Because English as a formal subject for a very long time was not taught in England, okay? Definitely not in higher education. 19th century onwards in schools, because students needed to be literate, so they needed to be taught writing. Now, as a point of beginning, I think I should make it clear that it is generally accepted that there are 4 skills in a language. We have the listening, reading, speaking, writing. It is called LSRW, where it is assumed, again more research needs to happen over there, but the assumption is that listening and speaking are something that you learn because you listen to language as you grow up. Speaking is something that you pick up as you grow up, because it is one of the survival skills, etc. Reading and writing are more formalized. Okay? I will not go into the distinction between receptive skills and these skills, etc. But reading and writing needs to be taught. It is something that does not come naturally to human beings. So, you need to be taught reading, you need to be taught writing, and therefore, it becomes a kind of a you need formal education for that. So, this for reading and writing, therefore, there were schools in England where reading and writing was taught, but no formal educational pattern where English was taught as a different subject. So, when they come to the colonies, they find this extremely difficult. So, what is the method that needs to be followed? So, 19th century onwards, we have these development of methods, and I am sure sir will agree that the same problems, for example, the French had when they encountered these massive colonies. Yeah? So, what we are going to do today is we are going to look at some of those methods that some of them are still in use, some of them have kind of fallen out of fashion, but are used, and I would like to hear your stories about it, whether they are still used in your country, in your context, etc. So, we are going to have a lot of discussions. At the end of the class, we are going to have, so I sent you, I think sir sent you some readings. So, if you have, so if you have looked at that, we will discuss a particular kind of teaching method, which is called task based language teaching, and we will try to understand what is task based language teaching. Okay. Now, there are different terms that are used in English language education for what we call methods. Now, I am using a general word called methods, but remember sometimes they are called principles, sometimes they are called approaches, sometimes they are called methods, and sometimes, which I have not put on the slide, they are called techniques. Okay. So, in English language education you have 4 terms. And one of the things that at least in India, if you are appearing for an interview in a school, the stock question is, what is the difference between a principle and a method? Okay. So, I think it will be a good idea to start with these distinctions. These are minor distinctions, there are overlaps, but I think it will be a good idea to start with distinction between what we call principles, approaches, methods and techniques. Okay. So, what I am going to do is I am going to use the most common definition that is available in a book, and I would recommend people who are interested in principles and approaches and methods of language education, English language education or for language education in general, to look at this book by Richards and Rogers. So, Jack C. Richards, who is here on the slide, and I have forgotten the first name of Rogers, but Theodore Rogers I think his name is. So, Theodore Rogers and Jack C. Richards. So, so here they have got a book called Principles of Language Teaching, okay, which kind of lists almost all principles and methods of language teaching that are available primarily in English, but they also look at other languages that were taught through these principles and methods. Okay. So, what are the differences between approach, this thing as you see on the slide? So, approach is basically the theoretical model that you have. Okay. So, you have a theory of education, you have a theory of teaching, you have a theory of learning, and that theoretical model is the approach that you use. Okay. So, for example, if you believe, we will come to all these later, but just as an example right now, if you believe that students can learn a language if I ask them to memorize. Okay. Now, remember, this is one of the most common methods that were used in many forms of classical education. So, if you take examples of Indian classical education, till, why am I calling it classical education? Actually, it happened till the 18th and 19th centuries. So, one of the things that students were supposed to do is to get into a class and first memorize the text. So, mnemonics played an important role. You first memorize the core text that you are going to study. For example, if you are going to study grammar, and the core text for grammar is Panini's Ashtadhyayi, what you first do is you memorize it without understanding a word of it. Okay. It is only after that memorization then the teacher would get involved and start explaining, because now you have got the text in your head. You do not really need a textbook in the class anymore. So, once the text is in your head, you can start making connections between different parts of the text. That is how Ashtadhyayi is read. So, you do not read it serially, you actually read it cross textually, So then you say, okay, this part of the text actually also links up to this part of the text, etc. Okay. So this is, so the philosophy is that mnemonics plays an important role when you learn something. So that's the approach. Okay. Now this approach is then guided by certain principles. Okay. So what are those principles? You make certain statements and you state certain beliefs that based on my theory, based on my philosophy of teaching, let us say philosophy of education, philosophy of language education, I will make certain statements. Okay. And sir would say that this probably is something that CFR does. For example, CFR makes these can-do statements. Okay. I am sorry, CFR. Okay, so let me write it down. It is, what is it? रेड वाला वहाँ पे है, मैं लेके आता हूँ. हटा देते हैं. Sorry. This is something that happens in the 20th centuries, but I will give this example. CFR is the Common European Framework of References for Languages. Now, one of the issues that you see, for example, in countries of Europe is that there are many languages spoken, right? So, you have French, German, Portuguese, Spanish, etc., etc. Now, if you are going to, let us say, test a person for language proficiency. Okay. For example, if I want to test you for Spanish, okay, there has to be some standard that I need to follow. Right? So, in order to create that standard, I need to make certain statements that if I say that, let us say you are a beginner's level language learner, what does it mean? Okay. And this is one of the major problems of testing and evaluation. So, all of you did your BA at certain points of time, and I am sure that all of you have got, let us say, 70%, 80%, 90%, etc. Okay. Now, if I ask you what does it mean, what does 80% mean, except saying that you are a first class distinction or whatever? We do not know. I mean, if I say what can you do with your 80%? It does not tell you, right? It simply gives you a mark. Okay. So, this is one method of testing which mostly the Indian education system follows. But there are other ways of testing. For example, if I tell you that if you score 80%, then it means that you are able to do these things or achieve these things or accomplish these things, then the 80% has a meaning. Okay. This is what the CFR did. So, they came up with what are now famously known as can-do statements. So, what is the language learner able to do if I say that the language learner is a beginner? So, if I say you are at a beginner level language learning, then these are the things that you needed to do. They of course divided it into 6 levels of learning. Okay. Shall I? Because many of them are in world literatures. No? So,
they have to be just
yeah. Yeah, yes, sir. Oh, right, right. So, these were the levels that they identified: A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2, etc. Many of you might have heard of the IELTS examination. Yeah. So, I am sure that many of you probably had to take it in order to come to a university. No, no one had to take IELTS. Okay, it's
here we have not made it
compulsory.
for
Okay,
foreigners.
okay.
Indians no, but foreigners sometimes
Okay.
they may have to.
So, for example, you're moving from Argentina to US, you have to take the IELTS or TOEFL, TOEFL test. So, TOEFL and IELTS are these international examinations which basically tests your proficiency in English. Yeah, it is all based on this. Okay, so if I say that so A1, A2 are seen as beginners level language learners, B1, B2 is the intermediate, C1, C2 is taken as advanced. So what I have done is I've made guiding statements and approaches. Now in order to, again this is very vague, what does it mean to be beginners? So what CFR does is actually gives you statements, what does it mean to be a beginner? For example, a beginner can go to a shop and do the basic transaction in a shop, or a beginner can ride a bus and do the basic transaction in a bus. A beginner, for example, can perform certain language functions like greetings, thanking, etc., telling the time, etc. Okay. The intermediate, of course, is a bit higher than that and needs more complex language operations. Advanced is even higher than that, which, so for example, if you are going to study at a university in Australia or New Zealand or UK or the US, even in some European universities now ask for a TOEFL or IELTS course, you need to have an advanced level because you are going to do much more complex language operations. Now remember, these were not meant for English. These were meant for, so it was common European framework for languages in a certain sense. So it was meant for all languages within the European Union. Of course, it was extended to other parts of the world later, but this is basically a framework of reference for languages. Okay? This is what principles are. Now, of course, when you go to the classroom, you need something to do in the classroom. So, you have to think in terms of, okay, these are the statements. So, let us say I am walking into a classroom where I have to teach beginners level English or beginners level French. Okay. So, then I have to think in terms of what is the instructional design that I need to make and what is the method. So, there has to be a step by step thing that I need to do in the classroom. Okay. When I do that, it gets a name. So, a method gets a name. For example, if I use a particular approach of teaching, then I produce a method. Okay. For example, the example that I gave you is that if I believe that, let us take another example, not the memory one, but if I believe, for example, that students learn language, that is the approach that I have, that is the philosophy that I have. If the students learn language through repetition. Okay. So, for example, if I say that repeat after me, and then the students repeat until the students get it right, I will ask them to keep on repeating. Okay. So, they have to get the pronunciation right, they have to get the intonation right, they have to get the entire sentence right, there cannot be any grammatical errors. Then they practice among themselves and they keep on repeating the same grammatical structure, let us say again and again and again. So, what I am doing is, this is my belief, right, that if you make students repeat, then they will learn a language. So, when I bring it into a class, it becomes a particular method of teaching. Okay. So, it becomes, for example, we are going to look into it, the audio-lingual method. So, it is called the AL method of teaching. Okay. And of course, in order to do that in the class, I will need certain techniques. So, I will employ certain procedures. Okay. So, there are certain things, certain material, certain techniques that I will use in the class. For example, in one of the methods that we are going to look at, the common belief is that students learn from each other more than from teachers. So, the technique that I am going to use in the class is put students together in groups or pairs. They will have a discussion, they will talk to themselves, they will learn the language from each other, and then they will get back to the teacher, where the teacher acts as a facilitator, etc. Okay, so, this is what the technique is. So, I have a method, but the method needs to be translated into actual things that I do in the class. Okay? So, those are the techniques. I will pause over here. Any confusions over here? You see that they are a bit overlapping, but approaches is the philosophy. So, you have the theoretical framework that you have. Yeah? So, it's the philosophy that you have. The principles is when you actually put them down. So, you might have a theoretical model, but the theoretical model needs to be translated into actual things that needs to be done. So, one of the things, for example, the CFR is a kind of a principle framework. Okay? The CFR does not tell you what to do in the class. The principle gives you the principles of learning language, and this is how you test a language, this is how you assess a language. In order to do this, you have to follow a method. So, if I want my students to learn beginners level language, I need to follow a method to do that. Once I decide on the method, then I translate that method into actual techniques that I use in the classroom. Okay? And every method are associated with techniques. Okay? All right. So, once we have got this clear, what are the methods, and I am going to stick to English language education, but this is where the discussion happens. I would like to know about your own experiences of learning English at whatever level you learnt English. Okay? So, let us get to some of the methods that we are going to look at, and these are, remember, historically major ones. There are many others which I am not going to look into. For example, sir will attest that in French there are many other methods that are used. In English, of course, these are the major methods, but if you know of something else, please do, we will have a discussion on that as well. So, the first method, as I told you yesterday, I think I just kind of very casually mentioned it yesterday, that started developing in 19th century is what is known as the grammar translation method. The grammar translation method is very different from, I think I should begin with this, is very different from what we call bilingual method. Okay. So, grammar translation method is not the bilingual method. So, people from the ASEAN countries and people from all over the world sometimes confuse the grammar translation method with the bilingual method. The bilingual method is that I bring something, for example, in English, I translate them into Spanish or Vietnamese in the class, I help students to understand the text through that translation, and the students then answer questions in English on that text. That is the bilingual method. This is not what the grammar translation method is. This was originally taken from Latin teaching. Okay? So, when Latin was taught, the Latin grammar was something that had a long history, but when European languages started getting taught in Europe, you needed a grammatical model. Okay? So, Latin was taken as the grammatical model. So, if you know Latin grammar, in fact, we were having a discussion yesterday about Hindi. I think someone asked a question about Hindi yesterday. Yeah, Jivadi asked a question about Hindi. So, we were having a discussion, questions, we were having a discussion even after that. So, one of the things that we must remember, that though we assume that Hindi has this Sanskrit grammar, it may not be true at all, because Hindi as a language happened in the 19th century, okay, as a standardized language. And many of the models of Hindi grammar were actually taken from grammars available of the language that were written by British officials. So, you may not be actually going back to Sanskrit grammar at all. You are actually taking a model of grammar available to you through the colonial officials and then applying it. Okay. So, what is the grammar translation method and what gets done? What you simply do in this method is, you take the grammatical rules of one language, let us say Latin or Sanskrit, and then what you do is you apply it to another language. Okay. You translate those rules to explain the other language. Okay. Now, why is it done? The thing is that the assumption over here in grammar translation method is that the Latin grammatical rules that let's say since English, and this was a long time belief that since English is derived directly or indirectly from Latin, then some of the grammatical rules of English, which is absolutely untrue, is derived, can be explained through Latin grammar. Okay? There is another reason, a hidden reason. A hidden reason is any language, in order to create an identity for itself, always looks for a long history. Okay? So, as long as you can go back, we are the oldest language in the civilization, as long as you can claim that, then your language has more prestige in a certain sense. Okay? And therefore, if you can trace back your language to Latin, which is one of the oldest in the European civilization, then of course, you can say that your language follows the rules of Latin grammar, even if they didn't. So, some of the early grammars of the English language really got into trouble with this when they tried to impose Latin grammatical rules into English. Extremely problematic. But they kind of overlooked these problems, they unsaw it and went ahead with it. And that is how, I don't know, our generation used to do this grammar when we were in school. There was a very popular book in India of grammar book. I am not very sure whether your generation has even seen it. So, there was this extremely popular book, red colored fad book called Wren and Martin. Anyone heard of this? You did Wren and Martin? Oh my God.
Even now, many of the CBSE schools,
That's
they consider it as the
Bible.
Those days there were two books,
Nesfield and Wren
and Martin. So Nesfield they consider it old fashioned. Then they have graduated to Wren and Martin. And some ICSE schools have taken a good grammar book, that is by A.S. Allen.
That is a good. Yeah.
W.S. Allen, the structures of English.
Yeah.
But most of the CBSE schools, they are still in Wren and Martin. Though they claim to be teaching communicative methods, but they are still in Wren and Martin.
So, people who have done Wren and Martin, so what did you learn from Wren and Martin? I will be interested to hear. So, what are the kind of things that you learned from it?
There were different exercises that we were given and we were just told in our classrooms. Like, these are the exercises, you go back home, you do it, you complete it and you bring it back. So, that is what we were doing.
What were the kind of rules that you learned from Wren and Martin, grammatical rules?
I think basic grammar, like, it started from what are nouns and pronouns and then words.
That's the first chapter. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that is how it started. That is how I can remember.
Parts of speech. Yeah.
Yeah, parts of speech.
Which is actually ridiculous in terms of English, because the parts of Latin parts of speech, if you look at English usage, then Latin parts of speech do not function in the same way as English so-called parts of speech do. Okay. For example, the nominal, the noun, yeah, or what we call the noun. The nominal in English functions in different ways than the nominal in Latin. Okay. Similarly, the idea of tense has these three distinctions of past, present and future. English doesn't have any kind of a declension for indicating the future tense. It has to use the past or the present to indicate future. Okay. But we are taught through many of these grammars, because it uses the Latin model, and then they are imposed onto English. Okay. And then you have to fit the language to the model. Okay. If something doesn't fit in, then it doesn't matter. So, these are seen as exceptions. Okay. For example, there is no regularization of the third person singular in English, which is always regularized, okay, in Latin, etc. For example, the third person singular can be he, she, they, etc., anything. But in Latin, because the verb conjugates with the third person singular, you can always make out what it is, okay, etc. But this was the method that was thought to be the best for teaching of English. So what you have is, you focus on the grammatical rules of one language, you apply those rules into another language to explain that language, and through that, basically a focus on grammar, through that you teach the language to the student. Okay. So you look at the grammatical rules, you apply it to another language, try to understand the language, and then the assumption is that you learn the language because you have learned both the grammar and how the language functions within that grammar. Okay. So this is the assumption. And therefore, what it involved was, and again your experience, how much of grammar rules did you have to learn in your education?
To an extent where it got really confusing.
In Bangladesh?
In our education, in English education, it started from learning the grammatical rules.
From the grammatical rules, okay.
In our childhood, but now that will change because from 1996, Bangladesh curriculum has adopted CLT method
Yeah.
instead of GPL method.
Okay, okay.
But classroom practice is not changed.
No, but that is true across the world. So there might be policy changes. By the time the policy translates into actual practice, it takes a very long time. Any other experience? How much of grammar did you learn?
We used to learn the grammar like mantra.
Really? In English classrooms? Okay.
Translation, tense, voice.
How much in Argentina?
I have English in secondary school, but we start by having these greetings, this everyday
Oh.
language, and then after that, you incorporate grammar by the language becomes complex.
Okay.
So, in that sense, you kind of identify a specific structures of grammar, but it was not grammar
Okay.
as a.
Okay. So you were more, well, you followed the CFR more than.
Also, our English was not very strong. We have just twice a week,
Okay.
2 hours, no more than that.
But in Argentina, for example, it's only recently in the last 20 years or so that English is required to some extent. Otherwise, you didn't hardly
For
require it.
example, at the university, the method of teaching is not
Oh, English at all. Yeah, yeah. I know.
And they don't require, even if you are
Doing your
a
PhD,
specific
yeah.
PhD or a specific bachelor in language,
Yeah, yeah.
it's not required.
Yeah.
What about Thailand? How did you learn?
How did you learn your English? You had grammatical rules?
It's very interesting.
Thailand, Cambodia, you should.
Thailand, English actually is not that much requirements.
Okay.
Because according to me, in my previous university, I'm doing bachelor in English department, but how to say, like, it's very tough according to my experience because I never have that much, very less in our secondary school or high school. We have the English as one subject only, but we are not emphasized as the important language
Okay.
because according to our tradition, English language is not that much importance
Yeah,
for
yeah.
finding job or have a good job.
Yeah, yeah.
It's unnecessary because the medium of language we use Thai to
Yes.
communicate. Even in my department, English department, but most of the teachers they are lecturing in Thai language, but we study English language.
You get the degree English, but
Yes, but we just it's like that is the the lacks of the potential of English department in
Yeah.
my university. I'm
Yeah.
not mentioned for other university
Yeah.
because there is a problem that I really interested in English language. I learned by myself. I don't know how to start. I just start. The first starting of my English language, I saw one foreigner. He's cycling into monastery. And then no one can speak English. And everybody's scared to speak with him. And they asking, where's the toilet? We don't know what is toilet. And then I just want him to go there like this body language. And after that, I am interested to study English language. The first study of mine, I still remember the Dhamma in English. Because I have to participate in competition in Dhamma in English. I remember, I don't know the meaning at all. The teacher gave me paper 5 pages. You remember 1 week, I give you 1 week. You have to remember all. And then you came and try to practice in the American accents. I just remember, I don't know what is the meaning, but I remember the topics, Buddhism and Science. That is topics. And you know what happened? I become a winner in that competition.
So you are the best speaker in English at that point.
5 provinces, there's 40 students. I become a winner, like incidentally, like I'm shocked, and after that I'm interested to study English. I bought some book like communication and try to remember. Mostly we are remember. We are not familiar with communication, mostly. We remember like A and mod. Mod is mean and.
Yeah.
A and mod, B bird, no. C cat, male, and that's it.
Yeah.
How the teacher they teach it in the class. And also even in my bachelor university, we are teach like a children class.
Yeah.
Everybody stand up. Good morning, teacher. How are you? I'm fine, thank you. And you sit down, please. And then after that, we talk in Thai. But our major is English language.
I know.
Yes.
So you get the degree, so that's not a problem.
Yes, we need all the certificates.
You get the degree.
We don't need the,
So good for you.
I'm really struggle and start with anything. Even nowadays.
Yeah.
If you're talking about it grammatically, I will say no. I will say I don't know at all. I just know how to speak, but I don't know this is wrong grammar, this is correct grammar or not.
Okay.
You know, because of we are jumped from the therefore we know 4 types of learning. One is listening. The second is speaking. The third one is writing. The last one is
Reading.
speaking. But we jump from listening and speaking. We jump into writing and reading. How can we communicating?
Yeah.
We are not accustomed with English language. That is the problem.
Yeah. Thank you.
It's a-
So, and I'm sure that this is the story not only in Thailand.
Not
This is
only
the
in
story across the globe and in many parts of India as well. So it's not simply that it is, so in many parts of India, for example, and if you go to rural India, this is the story. So teachers would say, and they would do similar things. They would learn catchphrases, formulaic language, good morning, how are you, I am fine, thank you, etc. And then the entire class will happen in Hindi or the regional language what is available there. Yeah, so that's a very common practice even today. So I'm not even talking about this thing. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
So, like I mentioned yesterday, we never had any grammar class like rules and stuff. The teacher came, we were given lesson, the English lesson, the literature, some lesson, and then we were asked like, some sentence, complete the sentence, or the teacher starts with a story. Then the teacher asked us like, what do you think will happen next? So in that sense, we were learning tenses, and then the teacher would arrive at the end that this is called this particular thing, and so that method was more like CNT.
So is this a convent school that you went to?
My school was CBSE.
CBSE board, okay. So this is something that again we need to keep in mind, that in many of the ASEAN countries, we also have this distinction between schooling. Okay. So the kind of, and of course the region that you belong to. So if you are in the city, you have more access to English medium education. If you are in the rural areas, you may not have access to, I mean, they might claim it is English medium education, but there is hardly any access to English medium education, etc. But remember, it's also the prestige that is associated with the language in a particular country. if the prestige is not very high, which is not the case in India, but in many countries the prestige is not very high. I mean, you just need English for as a subject, you need to pass that subject and that's it, because you don't need it outside the classroom. In India, because there is a prestige associated with the language, therefore there are other things associated with the language as well. So coming back to grammar translation method, good to know that a few of you did not go through this grammar translation method, though remember it has its advantages. Okay. And some aspects of grammar translation methods are still used. In fact, people in the so-called English speaking world are slowly coming back to the idea that it would be a good idea to teach grammar explicitly, instead of avoiding grammar and saying that, oh, let's do conversations, etc., because grammar is not simply something that describes the language. Grammar is also the structure of thought, how you think. Okay? And therefore, to develop your cognitive skills, skills that are related to your thinking, it is absolutely essential that you learn grammar as a category. We won't have time for this, but since we are on this topic, I'll just very quickly mention there is a specific branch of linguistics that started developing around the 1970s and 80s. This is called systemic functional linguistics. This was started by, well, not started actually, kind of, there were a lot of people involved in it, but the major person who was involved with systemic functional linguistics was a person called Halliday, M.A.K. Halliday. Halliday, so 3 arguments that he makes, and I'll just make those arguments, and he is the one who is a big, well, how shall we put it? He argues that grammar should be taught right from the childhood. It's not even a question of grammar should be taught at a higher level. He says grammar should be taught as soon as the students come to the class. Okay? And his argument, 3 arguments primarily in systemic functional linguistics, he says that languages, you cannot have a grammar of a language on an abstract idea. You need to look at languages as they are used today, okay? And then create a grammar first. Secondly, the grammar of a language also functions in different ways, and the analysis or grammatical analysis of a language gives you insights into the language, how a language functions. An example of this, again from Halliday, is what he calls transitivity in English. Okay? So, you know active passive in English, right? Okay. So, I can say things like the police arrested the black man after the riots. Active or passive? Active. How do you passivize it? Okay. But remember, in English, the passive has an option. In English, in the passive form, the subject can be dropped. So I can simply say, the black man was arrested, full stop, without mentioning the police. Okay? Now remember, it apparently shows the same thing. But if I choose the second option, then the grammar is functioning to also erase certain things. So I am erasing the function of police. Yeah? And this is what grammar can help you to do. This is what he says, the second thing. So grammar can help you to understand how languages function. Okay? And the third thing that he says is, it is absolutely important to understand languages not simply as individual sentences, but every language is a discourse. Okay? They are connected. You hardly in real life just speak a sentence and stop. all your sentences are connected to what others are saying, what in the context that you are saying it, etc. And this is again something that grammar can explain. Okay? And therefore, he advocates that grammar should be taught explicitly in the classrooms. He is no more, but this was what systemic functional linguistics did. And no one really now talks about grammar should not be taught in the classrooms at all, okay, because it had a massive influence in language teaching. Okay. So, let us keep that in mind, that though it seems a kind of an old method, sometimes old methods do make a comeback in some form or the other. So, there is nothing that gets deleted in history, remember. Okay. They will make a comeback in some form or the other. One of the disadvantages of grammar translation method was that you had to learn extensive grammar rules, okay, and vocabulary lists. So, you had to, why vocabulary list? Because vocabulary, remember, is intricately related to grammar. You cannot have words without grammatical forms. Yeah? So, you have to learn this words, list of words, you have to learn these grammatical rules, and then what the grammar translation method did was asked you to, for example, use a particular word using the particular grammatical form in a particular context in a sentence. Okay. That is what was believed the grammar translation method, that is what was believed in the grammar translation method. That is how you learn language. First you learn the words, okay. Then you learn the grammatical rules, then you use the words in combination with the grammatical rules to practice the language in a particular context. That is what it did. Yeah? And that is why I gave the example of Wren and Martin. Wren and Martin actually follows this. So, you will have a list of grammatical rules, you have a list of words, and then you combine them to produce sentences. So, it would be interesting to see the kind of exercises that you did. For example, someone said completion of sentences. Okay. Now, completion of sentences again uses the same method. Or sometimes you would be, I am sure that you had done this matching activity, right? No? They were called cross matching. So, they would look something like this. So, my so my region is still here, I think. Okay, let me write this. You must have done these kind of activities. And then there would be 4 or 5 sentences. You have to match agreement, right? He goes to school, she goes to school. Thank you. And then you have said, okay, now he will, these are called substitution tables. So, you'll have to choose the correct verb, to school. She, you'll have to choose the correct verb, to school. They, you have to choose the correct verb to go to school, etc. Okay, so this is what grammar translation method did. So, you would learn a list of words, list of rules, and then you apply those list of rules and list of words together. Yeah. Now, as you can see, the focus was on reading and writing. So, you would be able to read and you would be able to write. So, there was no jump like in Thailand. Okay. So, you started with reading and writing. Okay. The idea was that it was assumed that reading and writing is more important, and also remember the story that I told you. These were children who were coming to English schools, English speaking children, who were primarily, they would know listening and speaking, they would know how to speak. So, they would need to be literate. So the focus was on reading and writing, nothing else. Okay. Unfortunately, what happened was when this method started spreading across the colonies, this was the method that was adopted in many of the colonial domains. Okay. So this was adopted in India, in Sri Lanka, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Burma, in Nepal, and across the ASEAN countries, wherever the British reached. Okay. So the focus became reading and writing because of the grammar translation method. What basically started suffering was speaking and listening. Okay. And therefore you have, and since world literature people, let me give you an example from literature, 19th century literature. So there is this writer in Bengali, he wrote in English, called Shoshi Chandra Dutt. Okay. I am not very sure if you have heard of him. He belonged to this famous Dutt family in Calcutta, to which the poetess Toru Dutt belongs. Okay. Not Michael Madhusudan Dutt, he belongs to a different family. So Toru Dutt was the cousin sister of Shoshi Chandra Dutt. Shoshi Chandra Dutt wrote a number of things in English, but in one of the novels that he writes, called, what's it called? The Government Clerk. Okay. And there he talks about this clerk who keeps on talking to the boss, who is a British officer. And one of the comments that the boss makes is, you Bengalis have learnt English for such a long time, and yet you speak like a book. Okay. You don't speak like a normal human being. You speak as if you are reading a book. And of course, it goes on the novel. But speaking like a book was also because of this grammar translation method, because since the focus is on reading and writing, you are reading quite a lot, and you are writing in accordance with your reading, and you hardly remember the spoken language is very different from the written form. Okay. So when you start speaking, you speak like you write. Okay. And therefore it becomes extremely problematic, and this is one of the things that grammar translation method, the disadvantages of grammar translation method, that it did not focus on speaking and listening at all. Okay. So what is the next one? So how does it, so people started seeing that there are problems with this method, and therefore they moved on to what is now, I mean, there are a few methods in between which I didn't mention. I think I mentioned as a joke yesterday, there was also a method in between called the direct method. Okay. People who know the direct method, can please someone help me out? People who have done B.Ed.
Yes. Then you don't have to use any other language.
Yeah. So direct method is simply, if you are going to learn a language, only that language has to be used in the classroom. No other language can be used. Okay. And the direct method used to be very, very popular again in the 19th century, late 19th century, 1890s and 2000 onwards. So if you look at textbooks, these old textbooks that were used in classrooms, you will see in the preface that they will mention that this book is best used for direct method. Okay. What was the direct method? Again, use of the target language and only the target language in the classroom. This came from a certain method of missionary teaching, which later in French, for example, became immersion. You, sir, can tell you about immersion. Sir, please. This is a French method. Immersion.
You know, immersion method is when you see how do you learn swimming? You have to just put into the water, minimal help, and you will learn swimming. So immersion method has two aspects. One is this, that you are put in the what we call the linguistic bathtub, linguistic bathtub, and you will learn swimming. So in the linguistic pool you are thrown, and so in the classroom, like I also learned French. That is very effective in some ways. Like if I ask a question in English or Hindi, my teacher would answer me in French that I don't understand Chinese. So this is the response of my teacher. So gradually I will make efforts to convey it in French. So this is immersion method. There is another aspect of immersion method also. This is one aspect, that you are immersed in the language. The classroom is full of charts, etc., everything that is connected with French or any target language that we are learning, English. Or the other method is, which you mentioned also a little bit, you have two texts. So one text, the same content has been communicated to you in a particular language. Okay. So in a particular language which you know already. So I will speak. So in a particular language we have given you the content. Now you know the content, but the same content is now being provided in a language which you don't know, which may be a foreign language for you. So now content is not the difficulty. Content you have. Now you learn the expressions. So you are immersed in this way using bilingual methods. So you have immersion in both ways. You can use it bilingually, you can use it monolingually also in a direct method. And direct method also evolves later in different ways because of certain situations. And in fact, if you look at late 20th century, there are many books, but early 20th, but late 19th century also has this method. You see many people learned Greek, Old Greek, just by rote memorizing because they had the ability. In fact, the whole history of how we came to know about Troy, etc., actual place, is related to this. The archaeologists, they were business people, they learned language because they had to travel, number one, and number two, they understood the books, they crammed up the whole books, and they crammed up the translations, and by comparing these two in their mind, they learned the text, they learned the language and the nitty-gritties of the language and how different it was. And this you can find even in William Jones, many times when he writes, when he works. This you will find that he has Sanskrit Pandits and he himself knows Latin and Greek very well, classical Greek very well. So he continuously compares the two. So in this situation you can also see how classical languages are being taught, how living languages are being taught, and then immersion. See, for William Jones it was a kind of immersion in Sanskrit because he's totally surrounded by the Pandits using this the Sanskrit text when like Abhigyan Shakuntalam or many such texts is being translated. So there are different responses related to it, but immersion basically means that you are put in that linguistic situation completely, so the classroom becomes a different world altogether.
Thank you, sir. So remember, it's almost like a survival. So in order to survive, okay, so the moment you enter, for example, this building in the immersion technique, and you meet someone at the gate, and if you are asking that person directions towards the classroom, that person will only answer in the language that you're going to learn. You have to figure it out. Okay, so you are forced to learn because you will not be able to survive. Even if you need to ask a question, you need to learn to ask basic questions, etc. Now, the immersion, remember, is an evolution. Okay, the direct method, remember, was teacher controlled primarily. So the teacher would always use English in the classroom, and the students, if they want to respond to the teacher, would always respond in English or would not respond at all. Okay. So I'm leaving that method out. So let's come to this started developing around the 1930s and 1940s. And it has an interesting history. It is still used in many institutions. I'm sure that you people who have come through their BAs and people who have come through their schooling, did you have something called a language lab?
The schools have not yet taken.
They have not taken up language. Okay, I'll come to the language lab later then, since none of you have gone through that experience. Now, it has got an interesting context, I said, because this was primarily used to teach languages to American soldiers very quickly. Okay? I'm sure that if you have traveled around India, you would have seen these big shops saying that learn spoken English in 15 days or learn spoken English in 30 days. I'm sure it's there in probably in all the countries. So, or learn, and they're big shops. People actually pay money and go and. Now, we know that it's impossible to learn language in 30 days. A child is born into this world, takes 8 to 9 months to produce one word. The child says papa, mama, whatever, So, you can't learn a language in 15, 20 days, it's impossible. But the American soldiers that I am talking about were in a situation where they had to learn it because they were going to war. This is just before the Second World War, when America, remember, for a very long time was not directly involved in the war, but their soldiers of course participated in the theatre of war in Europe. Okay. After 1942, after the Pearl Harbor invasion, America entered formally the Second World War. So many of its soldiers were, for example, stationed in Japan, or in Thailand, or in Cambodia, or in India, or in many parts of Europe, where they had to communicate with the local population. These Americans, I think this is true even today, did not know any other language than the language that they spoke. And they had to be taught quickly. Remember, I can't teach you language for 2 years because you need to be posted to this war very quickly. So, you have to learn the language in 1 month and then go, at least the basics of the language. Because the belief was that if you speak the local language, then you can earn the trust of the locals. Okay, this was the belief. So, how do you teach a language in 1 month? And this was the method that they came up with. What is the audiolingual method therefore? It is based on this, remember, principles and approaches, etc. It is based on the philosophy of what is known as behaviorism. Okay. So, if you have heard the name of this person called Pavlov and the Pavlovian experiment, sorry, I am sure. So, Pavlov was a Russian psychologist who conducted a very famous experiment on dogs. And if you remember that experiment, that he would ring a bell and the dog, if it came near him, he would feed the dog. Okay. Later, of course, he showed that just by ringing the bell, the dog would start salivating. So, it had become a habit for the dog. The dog had associated the ringing of the bell of getting food, etc. Okay. This was Pavlovian experiment at that point of time, but of course, this experiment had a major influence on language learning. So, people like Charles Fries, for example, drew a lot of principles from structural linguistics and from the psychology of Skinner. So, Skinner believed, for example, I will not go into the details of this, but Skinner believed that language is learned through what he called habit formation. Okay. So, you form a habit. So, if I keep on repeating the same thing again and again and again, it becomes automatic language for you. Okay. So, it is automated. So, you can have automated responses to language. So, if I say good morning, you automatically say good morning. If I say how are you, as our friend from Thailand was pointing out, how are you, naturally say I am fine, thank you, even if you are not. Okay. So, these are automated responses, and these can be done through habit formations in a big way. And this was a very successful method to teach those American soldiers. So what the American soldiers would do is they will be taken into this so-called language lab, okay, and they will be given simple structures of language. For example, greetings. So if I am to teach greetings in French or Spanish or Portuguese or whatever, in Japanese or Vietnamese, etc., what is the structure of that greeting? I'll ask the students to keep on repeating that structure till they get it right. Okay. Then I'll send them to this language lab where they will have audio cassettes, where they will listen to these audio cassettes with these headphones on, and they will listen to this structure again and again, and they will record themselves by practicing it. The teacher will then look at the recording and say, well, you have got it right or you have got it wrong. Okay. For example, the pronunciation is not right, etc. So there was a lot of focus on pronunciation, for example. So this larger theory and principle became a method in itself, and as it happens with many methods, a method that was developed for short term language learning for American soldiers became a larger method of English education. It became extremely popular across huge number of countries, including India, ASEAN countries, though you might not have the resources to have a language lab, but this method of teacher coming to the classroom and repeating the same thing, I am not very sure, and this is very true of India, I am not very sure from the countries that you come from. In fact, you pointed out that you were supposed to use the American accent, right? Now, if you go back 2 generations in India, okay, and if you meet professors of English, okay, and if you talk to them, you will find that they speak almost like a Britisher. They have a very clipped accent, okay, which is gone now. But these 2 generations before, they all came through this method of audiolingualism. Now remember, the material that they were listening to, since they mostly had British or American accent, they would also pick up the accent. Okay. So many of these English professors, and I am sure the sirs English professors, would speak in a very British American accent, as if they are Britishers. Okay. Because one of the principles of audiolingual method was that language is also associated with culture. So if you are teaching language, you are also teaching the cultural patterns of that language, and it is important to pick them up. Okay. So let's see what happened in audiolingual method very quickly. I don't know, okay, yeah, all right. So what was getting done? Okay. So these are the principles, and this was what used to be done in the classroom. Okay. So these are the techniques and the methods that were used. The most common method was you carry a dialogue, okay, in a certain context. For example, today's topic, the teacher will come and say that today's topic in the classroom is future tense or future aspect. Yeah? So we are going to learn future today. How do you express future in the classroom? So what the teacher will do is they will construct a dialogue using the future. Okay. For example, my sister is going to go to the college next summer. Okay. To which college will she be going to? So I am using interrogative and I am using the future, but only a part of the future, because future can be expressed in English in many ways. So I am using the form going to. So if to which college is she going to go to, then the answer to that is she will be going to whatever, St. Xavier's College. Okay. So what I am practicing is the structure called going to, which indicates the future. Okay. So then I come to the class, this is what happens, I give you the dialogues. I ask you to repeat the dialogues after me, right. So what I do is I say, I will say the first sentence, you see the first sentence, I will say the second sentence, you will see the second sentence, etc. So you will repeat it. Okay. Then you practice it among yourselves. and then I give you another context in which you are supposed to use going to. Okay. So, this is the audiolingual method. There is no interference from the native language. Okay. So, what happened in the audiolingual method was it's almost like the direct method, no other language is to be used in the classroom. And to do that, as sir pointed out in the immersion method, the classroom will be filled with things like pictures. If you can't use the language, then you can use actions, okay, which also became a method later called the total physical response, but let us not get into that. So, you can even use actions, but you cannot use any other language. The third thing, the realia, is something that audiolingual method introduced. For example, it was very common in audiolingual method classrooms to bring, for example, advertisements from newspapers. They would also bring, for example, cooking instructions given in food boxes. Okay. And that will be, remember, cooking instructions have a particular structure. Can anyone tell me what the structure is? A recipe, it has a very particular structure. It's a procedure, okay. So, what is the grammatical structure that is used? For example, boil some water, add some salt, put some turmeric, add the ingredients into it. What is the structure in English? Remember, if you remember. They are commands, right? So, what are commands in grammar, in grammatical terms? They are called imperatives, right? So, everyone knows it, I am sure. Yeah, so you have imperatives. So, if I am teaching imperatives, I will bring a realia is a real life object. Okay. So, I will bring, for example, a cooking instruction, because these are the perfect examples of imperatives, and then I will say learn them, okay, etc. The third, of course, was the focus was always on correct answers and correct pronunciation. This was very, very important. You cannot give a wrong answer. For example, if a teacher asks a question, where is your sister going to go to next summer? And if you say my sister going to, the teacher will stop you immediately. So, no, wrong, try again. So, then you will say my sister going to, wrong, stop it, try it till you get it right. Okay. This was called drilling. It is an interesting term because it comes from military. So, this was called language drills. So, you would have language drills till you get it right. It is almost like a military drill. Okay. So, you cannot go wrong. Okay. And of course, if there was some mistake in the pronunciation, the teacher would immediately correct it. The teacher would immediately say, no, this is not how it is done, try again, etc. Okay. So, you can see that teacher is completely in control of the classroom in this method. So, the idea was that language is learned through habit formation, and the prevention of errors is important. So, these 2 points are related. So, you learn the language through habit, you cannot make an error, and all errors have to be prevented. Okay? So, you cannot make a wrong this thing. This I have already explained to you, the point about speech is slotted. So, you have these something called the substitution drills. Okay. So, one I gave you an example of, this is a good example of a substitution drill. Okay. So, in an audiolingual method class, I will make you repeat each of these sentences. Okay. And if someone says, he go to school, no, get it right. Until another person gets it right, you cannot. So, these are called substitution drills, but substitution drills can be of different types also. One of the things that audiolingual method did, and this comes from behavioral psychology, remember the dog used to get food if the bell is rang. So it was believed that in language learning, it is absolutely important to give positive reinforcement. I'll try to show you how. Okay. So I would like a raise of hands. I'm going to ask you a question. Okay. Or no, maybe let's do it some other way. I need one volunteer. Can come over here. Any volunteer, anyone. It's not going to be a very difficult thing to do. Let me assure you. Come. You are a teacher. Okay, so I'm going to give you a topic. I'll give you around 30 seconds to think about the topic, and then I would like you to start speaking on the topic. Okay. Okay, what is your favorite hobby? Singing. Okay, so think about what you're going to say about singing. Speak for about a minute, and then I'll stop you. Okay. Yeah? So the topic is, what is your favorite hobby? The topic is, what is your favorite hobby? Your favorite hobby. All right. So in this topic, you speak for a minute, singing, for example. Okay. So we're going to listen to her for a minute. So I would like all of you to. Sorry, I can't move out of camera range. So I would like all of you to listen to her very, very carefully. Okay. Please keep your pen and papers ready. If you notice a mistake, I'm sorry, I'm putting you under a lot of pressure. If there is a mistake, please note it down. Don't tell it to her. Note it down. Yeah? And then we'll see what happens. Ready? Okay, go. Oh, sorry. Yeah, please.
Good morning, everyone. So my topic is my favorite hobby. My favorite hobby is singing. Singing is something which makes me delightful, which makes me happy, which makes me escape all the sufferings of this world. Singing is my ultimate joy. When I am singing, I forget everything and I love myself. So I'm sure you all like music. And you don't have to be a trained singer to love singing or to love your voice. You just have to start singing, humming, and that will just make your mood very light and happy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So give her a hand, come on. Okay. Please, yeah, thank you. So, any errors? You're all the teachers.
I don't know if it's an error.
Okay.
I've never heard this type of usage. Makes me delighted.
All of you noticed?
Delighted maybe.
Okay.
I don't know, maybe it's
So what is the correct usage for this?
delighted. Makes me delighted.
Makes me delighted. I am delighted. Okay.
Makes me delighted.
Now, let me also tell you that there is, when you are speaking, there is a lot of pressure of two things. One is instant thinking. Second is translating that thinking into language. Okay. And the third thing, of course, in this situation, that we have a formal recording going on, and she's speaking in front of the class with the teacher standing in front of her, and she knows that everyone is going to notice the mistake. So there is a third pressure which also affects language. Okay. So what did we do when she began? Good morning. You responded. Okay. Once she finished, all of you clapped. Okay. What are these? Why did you clap? I mean, you didn't want to clap. I forced you to clap, but that's a different story. So these are automatic responses, also known as positive reinforcements. Now this is a longer piece that she did, okay? But imagine if she produces a sentence correctly, and for every sentence that she produces correctly, the teacher keeps on saying, very good, very nice, well done, okay? These are all called positive reinforcements. Audiolingual method used it because the belief is, remember, that language is a habit formation, and because it is a habit formation, it needs positive reinforcements. Remember the dog? The dog needs to be fed, because if you simply ring the bell and don't give the dog anything, there is no positive reinforcement over there. Okay? So positive reinforcements became an important part of language teaching. So every act, for example, the bravery that she had to come over here and speak, has to be positively reinforced. This is mostly done by teachers. What we did in the class right now is a different method, but the positive reinforcement, if it is there, remember it's a standard practice in all language classrooms today. So if something is done correctly, you reinforce it by saying nice things about it. Okay? This was primarily what the audiolingual method did. A few other things that I thought I'll just mention before we move on to the other method. There was a belief that, remember, the focus was quite a lot on speech, because this was meant as a training method for American soldiers. They didn't need to learn to write. They were not going to write letters to anyone over there. So this was meant primarily for speaking, okay? So instant speaking. And therefore, both verbal and non-verbal cues became important. So what you do is it's not simply language that you use, but also the gestures that accompany that language that become important. Okay? And so there were lots of picture cues that were used in the classroom. For example, the teacher will come with a picture, ask the student to respond to the picture in a certain way, etc. The other thing that they believed in is what is called a pattern practice. Now, all of you are aware that in any language, the number of grammatical rules are always finite. Okay? That is the beauty of all human languages. You do not have infinite grammatical rules. All grammatical rules are finite in nature. It is the capability of the language to produce infinite sentences using the same grammatical rules. Okay? So what languages can do is produce infinite number of sentences using finite number of structures. The belief in audiolingual method was that if you teach the students this finite number of rules, for example, the number of sentence rules in English varies a bit. Let's say it's between 154 to 157. Okay? So just to give you an example of this, so in English the sentences can take this form. Okay? This is the most common. So you have the subject, verb, object. Okay, I ate something. But you can also have things like simply subject and verb. Okay, you can also have things like subject, verb, object, complement. For example, I ate an apple not delightfully, but let me think of a complement. I ate an apple which was sour in nature. Okay, and I can keep on adding to this. So I ate an apple which was sour in nature yesterday. So you add an adverbial noun, okay, etc. So I can keep on adding in this structure, and I can keep on changing the nature of structure. The nature of permutations and combinations in English is, so I can, for example, move the A over here. Yesterday I ate an apple that was sour, etc. Yeah? This is limited. the kind of permutations, combinations that you can do. So the belief in audiolingual method is if you can teach these finite number of structures, the students will be able to produce the language. So if I can teach you 154, 160 grammatical rules of English, then you will be able to produce the language using these rules. Okay. So there was a lot of this pattern practice. So pattern is these, subject verb object complement, subject verb object complement adjunct, etc., etc. Yeah. And the idea was you had these answer drills. Okay, so you take one structure and then you keep on repeating that structure in the classroom. Okay, we can do this right now. I want all of you to respond in one single voice, so no one sleeps. All right? Okay. I want you to, the rules of the game. I want you to respond in complete sentences. You cannot say one word. You have to respond in complete sentences. Okay? What is this? Can we be a bit louder, please? Okay. What is this? What is this? No, I think some people are using just one word, complete sentence. This is a phone. Okay. Change of pattern. Is this a phone? Full sentence. Is this a pen? What did you practice? Which grammatical pattern did you practice? Okay, but there is another basic pattern. So when I am asking the question, what is? So you are questioning, so you are practicing interrogatives. Okay, but you are also responding to interrogatives through another form called the declarative. So I am using two patterns at the same time. So what I am doing is I am teaching you, and then what I will do if I am an audiolingual method teacher, I will say, you do the same thing with her. So then you will pick up objects and say, what is it? And you will repeat the same patterns again and again and again. So you have pattern practice, which, remember, can be very effective if you are trying to teach the language very quickly, because you have learned the pattern in a certain way. So the belief was that language consists of automaticity. So a large amount of language that you produce is actually automatic language. Okay. So our Thai friend over here said that, remember that part, good morning, how are you, I am fine, thank you. It's automatic. This is what you have been taught as a formula. It is like a formula that you learn. Okay. And formulas can be troublesome. So for example, if you go to the UK, if you ask someone how are you, you might get different sorts of responses, and you might get a bit of a cultural shock. Okay. For example, one of the most common responses in the Midland areas of England is they will never say I am fine, never, ever. So if you ask them how are you, they will say not too bad. Okay. Or good enough for today. It is not the formulaic response, but if you know the formulaic response, then you expect that there might be variations in this. Okay. So this is what they believed was something they should be able to do. So the student should be able to produce language without thinking or overthinking, almost automatically in a formulaic way. Again, remember the context of this language teaching method, meant for American soldiers who needed to greet people, to buy things, to ask questions like how much is this? Okay. So they just needed that kind of a language. So the focus was on structural patterns and not vocabulary. Not much vocabulary was taught in audiolingual method, very different from grammar translation. Remember, grammar translation had vocabulary lists. So the idea was the grammar should be learned inductively. So you practice the structure and then you get to the rule of the structure. So that's what we did. So when we were doing the interrogative, I first asked the question, you responded, and then I told you what we are practicing now is interrogative. Okay? So you come to the rule later, you practice the structure first. That was the idea. And this is the most important part. They believe that language and culture are inseparable. So if you are teaching a language, you also have to teach the culture. Okay? Again, remember the context, American soldiers in Second World War, so you cannot use language in an inappropriate cultural form, because that might offend people. Okay? That always reminds me of this use of the prepositional form sometime. So what does sometime mean? So when we say sometime, what does it mean? Time to time. Okay. So let me ask you a question, or let me tell you a story. Okay. So someone has gone to America, and they're studying in the same class, and one person, person A, asks person B that, so would you like to have coffee? And that person responds, yeah, sure, sometime. What does it mean? So person A asks person B, would you like to have some coffee? And person B responds, yeah, sure, sometime. What does it mean? Not right now. Okay. Any other? You've got it right. That is what our understanding is, and that is how language is associated with culture. In America, if someone tells you sometime, it actually is a very polite way of saying not interested. You simply say not interested. But exactly in America, for example, there is something called a feedback loop in language. So when you talk on the phone, I don't know how you, it will be interesting to know how you talk on the phone. So when you talk on the phone and you say hello, and that other person says hello, or whatever greetings you use. So when you speak, do you expect some sort of response from the other person, or do you think that I should complete my whatever I need to speak, and then the other person should respond? Hello, okay, fine. Okay, so that part is over. So the initial exchange is over, okay. But when you are speaking, for example, you want to say that, okay, today we had this class and it was a very long class, it was extremely, blah, blah, blah. So you're going, so do you expect that that person will give you some sort of a verbal feedback like, okay, yeah, do you expect that, or don't you expect that? You expect it? If the person doesn't do it, if you don't hear anything from that side and you are speaking, what happens? Are you there? That's what you asked, right? Am I audible? Now it's interesting because it varies from culture to culture. In America, if you are speaking to someone, it's common to give what is known as a feedback loop. So what you do is, the other person shows that they follow what you are saying. So in America, if you are speaking to someone, they will keep on saying, yeah, okay, So there is a constant feedback loop. In Japan, it is considered to be insulting. It is seen as interrupting someone. So if you are speaking and if you keep on yeah, they would stop. Okay. They would think that you have something to say. Now remember, these cultural variations, you might know the language perfectly, but these cultural variations also produce huge amounts of cultural misunderstandings. Yeah? In fact, nowadays it's become kind of in urban areas in India, it has become common now, but it's not very common in India, even if you go to rural areas, to say thank you. It's not a common practice. So if you buy something from a grocer's store or from a sabzi wala, once you get the vegetables from that person, you don't really say thank you. Okay? It's not a very common practice at all, which is seen by a large number of Anglophone countries, visitors who come over here, as a kind of an insult, because thank you is a common gesture over there. You must say thank you, yeah, etc. So these kind of things were taken care of by the audiolingual method. So along with language, culture was an important ingredient in audiolingual method teaching. So you also needed to teach cultural patterns of a language. So someone was talking in the morning, and this is the third method that we are going to look at, is the communicative language teaching, which is the most recent. I really don't know whether to call it a method or whether to call it an approach. Yeah? Now communicative language teaching, as the name suggests, was a kind of a reaction against audiolingual method. Why was there a reaction? The reaction came because they thought that audiolingual method had reduced language to a formula. So what students were learning through this drill practice and pattern repetitions are simply formulas of language. But this is not how language really operates outside in the world. So when you are learning a language, when you are using a language in the world outside, it operates in a very different way. There are too many variables that you cannot control. Not everyone is going to ask you a question in the interrogative. Yeah? A request can be made simply as a suggestion. For example, you walk into the room, your friend is sitting in the room, and you say, wow, it's really hot outside, I would love a glass of water. And the friend gets up and gets a glass of water. What you have made is, you have made simply statements of facts. But the friend understands and takes it as a request and goes and gets a glass of water. So you don't really use always the structures of a language to produce the intended effect of that structure. You do not always use interrogatives to get an answer. You might simply make a statement, very common in Indian English, for example. Yeah? People who have been in India for sometimes, especially people from other countries, they would understand Indians have this habit of saying no at the end. Okay? For example, you coming to the party, no? Now remember, no over there, basically it's a statement, you're coming to the party, but then what the no does is functions as the interrogative. So instead of saying, are you coming to the party, they will say, you are coming to the party, it's a statement. No means, are you or are you not? Yeah? And then you say, no, I'm too tired, etc., whatever. Yeah? So there are different ways that actual language use operates. And unfortunately, communicative language teaching thought that audiolingual method is not able to capture that. There are advantages of using it. If you want to learn structures very quickly and use language as a formula, fine. But real language learning goes much beyond that. Okay? And therefore, what happened was, remember, audiolingual method drew heavily from structural linguistics, especially the linguistics of Chomsky. Okay. Sir, have they done Chomsky? Yeah. Now, Noam Chomsky, of course, got a famous name, published in 1957 a book on the grammar of language, where he suggested that any grammar of language can be understood in terms of the structures that they have. And he created what are known as the tree diagrams of language, where he said that what happens with languages, if you know the structures in which the languages operate, it is easy to learn a language. Okay? And he came up with this idea of what he called linguistic competence and linguistic performance. Okay? So, what is linguistic competence? Linguistic competence is any speaker of a language would know, for example, the grammatical structures that are there. So, if you are a native speaker of a language, okay, I will give a personal example. So, when I went to Gujarat, a state in the western part of this country, long time back, 25, 26 years back, I come from a language background which does not use a very strong grammatical gender. Okay. Bengali and Malayalam, for example, does not have this concept of a grammatical gender. So, you cannot distinguish. In Hindi, for example, it is easy because the verb inflects, and because the verb changes, you can, even if I say something else in the subject, you will be able to find out what the gender of that person is. In Bangla, you cannot, because the verb does not inflect. Okay? And therefore, for Bengalis, and that is a common joke across India, it is extremely difficult to deal with languages that have very strong grammatical genders, like Hindi. Gujarati is even stronger. Okay. So, when I stayed over there for 1 year, I thought I had learnt enough Gujarati to try my Gujarati on with other people. So, I would go to these places, shops and petrol pumps and other places, I would use my Gujarati. And within a few seconds, these people would realize I am not a Gujarati, and they would resort to Hindi. Okay. I kept on trying, and then I realized somehow intuitively these native speakers, I mean, if you ask them what rule was I violating, they will not be able to tell you a word about it. But somehow intuitively they understood that something is wrong over here. This person does not seem to be speaking like me, okay, etc. So, there is an intuitive understanding of that there is some sort of an error that is happening over here. Yeah? And especially most of them were grammatical gender errors, okay, because Gujaratis would have gender for everything. So, they will neuter the masculine and the feminine gender for everything in the world. And this is something that communicative language teaching realized was also happening with the audiolingual method. Okay? That you did not understand that certain cultural patterns cannot be simply done through drill practice, okay, etc. Coming back to Chomsky, so Chomsky's structural linguistics was primarily something that could explain the, so linguistic competence is the grammatical structure that you understand. Okay, so we come back to linguistic competence. So it is the grammatical structure. Every human being, in fact, Chomsky would go on to say in his later works that a human being is born with a grammar. So he calls it universal grammar. So they are born with a grammar. You cannot escape grammar, because that is one of the survival things inbuilt within you. So, you are, as a human being, if you are born, you have grammar inside you. Okay? So, this is linguistic competence, but there is also something called linguistic performance. It is not simply that you know the grammar, because you need to know how to use this grammar. in real life, and that is what you learn as you grow up in any community or in any language. Okay? You learn the usage of that language. Chomsky was not interested in linguistic performance. Chomsky said it is too messy. So, as a grammarian, I cannot look at each and every usage and create a rule out of it. As a grammarian, I have to create an abstract rule, okay? And therefore, he was interested in linguistic competence. And the Chomskyan structural model became the model for audiolingual method in a sense. Okay? And it was against this model that you have people like Delheims, for example. In 1971, he had a very famous article which he published called On the Idea of Communicative Competence. He said it's fine to think of linguistic competence. Of course, people need grammar to use a language, but people also need to know where to use that grammar correctly, appropriately, and it doesn't matter how much accurate you are, but it matters more how appropriate you are. So, you might make grammatical errors, that does not matter. Okay? But as long as you are able to communicate even ungrammatically appropriate amounts of meaning, that is what communication is about. Okay? This is something that many of these people, this group of people who were associated with communicative language teaching thought is missing in language teaching. That there is just too much of focus on accuracy. You learn the correct language, use it correctly, rather than on appropriacy. So, language needs to be understood in its appropriate context. Okay. We will discuss Helmholtz a bit more later, and therefore, it replaced this situational structure based language teaching in the 1960s that was used, and it is still the method that is still very popular, though people have challenged communicative language teaching as well. But communicative language teaching, why it is called communicative language teaching, I think we need to understand that before we get into what really happens with communicative language teaching. We will do an activity on this. So, what are the principles on which they are based? Communicative language teaching is based. The first thing, of course, is that meaning becomes more important than form. So, what many of these people said is that the focus of language learning should be on meaning rather than how that meaning is expressed. I gave you the example of that you always do not use an interrogative to ask a question. You might use different forms to ask a question. Okay? You always do not use an imperative to request or to order or to command. It can take different forms. But if I make this assumption that if I teach you the form, you will learn the meaning, it does not work like that. So, first the focus has to be on how meaning is generated, and then what the forms it can take different forms. We can learn the forms later, but the focus should be on the meaning of language itself. Okay? So, the focus therefore was on communicative functions, okay? And this is where their major contribution was. So, instead of, and of course, this also came from what I mentioned earlier, systemic functional linguistics. So, the idea was that languages are not simply structures of grammar. Languages perform certain functions. Heinz, for example, said that I am not interested in what, well, I am interested, but not very interested in what language is, but what language does. Because if I can have hundreds of grammatical rules in my head, but once I use that language, it performs certain things. Okay? Just to give you an example, there is this language function called performative. Okay. What is a performative? It is a very peculiar thing in English and many other languages. A performative is, it requires certain conditions to be performed. So, you cannot use that language. To give you an example, imagine that you are in this university, your library which is getting built is finally completed, and there is someone who will come and inaugurate that building. Okay. So, this person will come and probably cut a ribbon or whatever, and then go and give a speech, and then this person will go away. Okay. But all these things have to be performed before the person can give a speech. Okay. Now, these strange things in English and many other languages are called the performatives, where you have to perform it in order for the grammatical structure to emerge. Okay. For example, all of you watch, I am sure, the Olympics. So, before the Olympics begin, the president of the International Olympic Association comes on the stage and says, I hereby declare the Olympics open. With the utterance of that sentence, the Olympics are opened. So, the language does something, it immediately performs an action. Okay? It is these kind of performances or functions that communicative language teaching was primarily interested in. So, what are the kind of functions that languages can perform? Okay? And once the focus moves from grammar to functions, then probably it will be more useful in using language in real life situations. Okay. The third thing, of course, therefore, that no language exists in vacuum. All languages are no meaning can come out from a vacuum. So, if you remember your Ren and Martin, you would have these sentences, right? He is going to school, or she is doing something, etc. Okay? But remember, the same sentence in different contexts can mean completely different things. Okay? So, what you are learning is simply a grammatical rule. If it's a decontextualized sentence, which is important. But at the same time, you also must learn that the same sentence in various other contexts would mean different sorts of things. Okay? So, contextualization becomes an important aspect. So, no language should be taught without a context. Okay? And of course, it is not simply accuracy, but also appropriacy that needs to be taught in the classroom. So, it is not that you become an excellent speaker of language and you are absolutely inappropriate. Okay? So, both appropriacy and accuracy become an important aspect of language teaching. Communicative language teaching brings back local languages in the classroom, okay? But they say its judicious use and translations are possible in the classroom. So, you move away from the direct method. So, it is not simply the language that is getting taught. You can use other languages in the classroom, but only after they said it should be judiciously used. Okay? So, you should not replace the target language with only translations. Okay? So, as the story that we heard in Thailand, where for the initial, except for the initial greetings, the rest of the class was completely in Thai. Okay? So, those kind of practices should not be there, but judicious use of the language has to be there. This, for the first time, they said that you cannot teach listening, reading, speaking and writing separately. It is impossible. All these language skills are related, and therefore, what they promoted is what they called integrated skills. Okay? They of course added critical thinking to it. They said language is not simply listening, speaking, reading, writing, it is also thinking. Okay? So, you have 5 skills now which need to be integrated. Okay? So, you cannot really separate that listening and speaking are separate, reading and writing are separate, let us learn them separately. Okay? So, you have to integrate all of them, because this is how human beings learn advanced language. It was accepted that struggling with the language is essential, it is central. Okay? So, you it is not like audiolingual method, you are mistaken, repeat again, you are mistaken, repeat again. If you don't struggle, then you can't learn. This is the basic approach behind this, basic philosophy behind communicative language teaching. That you have to accept the fact that language learning is a long-term process. It is not something that can be done at a short term. It is a long-term process and you have to accept it. Remember, there was a lot of second language acquisition and psychological theories that were already available at that point of time, and people were showing how children learn a language. And children learn a language over a long period of time. As I told you that, by the time a child acquires one word and the entire language mechanism gets triggered, it's already 8-9 months. And during these 8-9 months, the child listens to language constantly. The parents are talking to the child, any visitor to the child keeps on talking to the child, etc., etc. It's only after that the child learns. So it's a long-term process. You really cannot simply learn a language very quickly. So the goal of language learning, and this is what Himes said, is not simply linguistic competence. Of course, grammar is important, but also what he called communicative competence. What is communicative competence? He said communicative competence has 4 aspects. First, he said grammatical competence. Okay. So you need to understand the grammar of a language in order to use that language. Second, he said sociolinguistic competence. You should be aware of how the language is used in a particular culture, in a particular context. Okay. Third, he said discourse competence. Discourse competence is something that comes from the works of Halliday, systemic functional linguistics. Halliday showed that no language operates as single sentences. All languages are discourses, and therefore there is a strong connection that every discourse has, and every language has strategies to make sure that ideas are connected in a certain way. Okay. So in English, for example, the 2 major ways that discourses are built up are through these 2 principles called cohesion and coherence. Okay. So cohesion is how, for example, an idea travels across language, and coherence is the actual things. For example, in English, just to give an example very quickly, if I say this sentence, I am planning to go to Rajgir tomorrow, however, if it rains, I might cancel my plans. Okay. One sentence. I will come to the question later. The second utterance, the second discourse is, I am teaching in the class, it is going to rain in Calcutta tomorrow. How is the first sentence more understandable than the second one? So what I have, the first one has coherence, and the coherence is marked in language. So what I did was I said I'm planning to go to Rajgir tomorrow. However, so what I'm doing is I'm marking it with a marker. I'm saying, well, I'm going to say something different now. Okay. And the second one, since there is no marker, it might make sense if I put in a cohesive device, but it is not making sense because these seems to be 2 completely separate statements. Okay. And this is what Himes said in his communicative competence model, that this is an important aspect of how ideas are strung together in a discourse, and people should be taught that as well. This has been neglected. So it's not simply grammatical structures, but how those grammatical structures are connected to each other. That is important in any language learning. And the fourth one, interestingly, that he added was what he called strategic competence. Now, what is strategic competence? we need a separate volunteer now to understand strategic competence, because I think I'm speaking for a long time now. So let's have some fun. Another volunteer? Come. The same thing. I'm going to give you a topic, but I'm not going to give you any time. As soon as I say the topic, you have to start speaking. Okay? All right? Are you comfortable? Sorry. Are you comfortable with your favorite book? Oh yes, film, favorite film. No? You do not. Vacation. No? Okay, your favorite city. City. Yeah. But you don't have time. She's going to start speaking right now. Start.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about my favorite city. Not actually, but I'm going to talk about my favorite state in India, which is Sikkim. Obviously, because it is my favorite state because I have done my bachelor's from there. It is my favorite because it is similar to Bhutan. It is like the weather there is very cool. It's not like it's very hot or something like this because I am adapted to. I'm adapted living in cold places. So Sikkim is the best place for me to live, and also people there are similar to Bhutanese. So whenever I was in Sikkim, I never felt like I was in another city or I was in another country. I always felt like home. That's why Sikkim is my favorite state in India.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. How many times did she say favorite? Why? 5 times. Oh, you were counting actually. So why? Why do you think she was using the same word? Or the best city? Or she was trying to emphasize? Or she was not able to find the alternative word? She is under pressure. She did replace it with best later. Best city, this thing. How many times did she move away from the topic and then come back to the topic? 3 times.
She was referring to it. She was referring to the word that was given to her in order to make a clear statement. I think, because she was connecting all the arguments to that one word.
Yeah.
Which was, I think, yeah.
This is exactly what strategic competence is.
It was like
I'm sure that all of you had this experience that you know the word either in your own languages, your home languages, or in a foreign language that you have learned, that you know the word but you just can't get it. I'm sure that all of you had this experience. It's there in your head, at the tip of your tongue, you can't really get the word. Now, obviously what you do is you don't stop when you're speaking. You go around it. You try to, as it's called, circumlocute it. Okay? Now, these are strategies that are also important in learning a language, because if you get stuck, so she has the competence of going around it. She has so that's why she is digressing, and then she realizes, and then she comes back to the topic. That is why she is saying the same word. She knows, if I keep on thinking about another synonym for favorite, I'm going to waste a lot of time. So she keeps on repeating the same word. And when she is repeating it, she suddenly realizes, oh, I can use the word best city. So at the end of the speech, she says, oh, this is one of the best cities that I have. You understand? These are all strategies that people use when speaking or writing or listening. I'm sure that when you listen to people, there are points of time when you miss out on a word, or you don't really understand what is happening over there. That doesn't mean you stop listening. you listen to the later part of it and try to make sense of what the person was saying earlier, okay, and then you start making sense of it. Now, these are all part of strategic competences, and a good language learner would use all these strategies at the same time. Okay. Repetition is one of them, but there are many other strategies that people use. One, of course, is what is known as a feedback question. So, I am sure that you are talking to someone and you don't get what the other person is saying. So, what do you do? Imagine that you are talking to someone and you don't really understand what the other person is saying. Okay, so one is repetition. If you want to be really polite and okay. I mean, you don't tell the person to shut up, you know, you don't say, okay, this is too much, I can't really understand anything what you are saying. So, there are also formulas available in language which produce strategy competences. Okay. So, I beg your pardon, can you come again, etc., where these can be taught as forms of strategic competence. Okay. And this is what Heinz was talking about. So, you have the grammatical, the rules of grammar, the cultural, the social and the cultural, the discourse, how languages are connected, how ideas are connected, and strategic, the different kinds of strategies that you use in order to negotiate language. And all these four, remember Chomsky was simply talking about the grammatical. Heinz said in order to learn a language, you need to learn all these four, otherwise you cannot learn a language. Okay. So, against the audiolingual method, they said language is a creative act, okay, and you can be extremely creative with language, as all of you are aware of. So, languages, it is impossible to, well, to some extent it is true that you learn language through drills, but you can't go beyond a certain point only through drills. In order to be creative, you have to move ahead of those drilling. So, what the teacher's task is to motivate use of language by encouraging classroom interaction through pair and group interaction. Okay. So, in a communicative language teaching class, typically will not be sitting like this at all. You will be sitting in small groups and you will be constantly discussing. Okay. This comes from a certain philosophical concept from a Russian philosopher and psychologist called Vygotsky. Okay. So, Vygotsky had this idea, he said that languages can only be learned through what he called ZPD, the zone of proximal development. Yeah. So, you need someone through which you learn language, and that someone generally should have a level of language just higher than yours. If that someone has a level of language lower than yours, then you will not be able to learn. That person will learn, but you will not be able to. Okay. So, you have this zone of proximal development where basically you learn languages through each other. No languages can happen without what he called social interaction. So, his theory is called social interactionism, but no languages will be learned without a social interaction. So, communicative language teaching believes that for languages to be learned in a classroom, people need to talk to each other rather than the teacher constantly telling them what to do. Okay. So, the teacher in communicative language teaching becomes a facilitator rather than simply standing and giving a talk, etc. Okay. So, it is a more collaborative framework. So, the philosophy is that that any knowledge is created through collaboration, okay. And since language is a form of knowledge, it requires more collaboration. Okay. Any questions before we come to the last part of it? How are we doing for time, sir?
We have 15 minutes.
15 minutes, okay. So, I think we should have enough time at the end. I will try to finish this very quickly to have a discussion on the things that I sent you, that sir sent you yesterday. Any questions? Any? Yes. Yeah.
Because sometimes this teacher should follow the curriculum. So
Yeah.
the teacher is not able to teach them from basic.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's a very good question actually. One of the criticisms of communicative language teaching has been that it assumes a different kind of a classroom. What happens if the students in the classroom, as in your classroom, do not have even the basic English? How are you going to ask them to discuss, sit in groups, do what? Okay. Now there are ways out of it, and this is one of them. But communicative language teaching says that, so one way out, one technique that is used, that's the last part, is you create what they call group magnets. So let's say I put 4 of them in a group, okay, and I give them a topic to discuss, or I give them some task to do, etc. Okay. Now I make those groups in such a way that there is at least one person in the group who has some proficiency in the language. Most of the discussions that happen in the group might be in the regional language or in the local language. Okay. But then, because the person who knows English also conveys to the others what is happening, what needs to be done, etc., there is some learning happening over there. Okay. So one of the issues that communicative language teaching faces is, first is this: what happens if you have very low proficiency in the classroom? So one of the techniques, as I said, is using what they called a language magnet. So you use one student at least in each group which knows some language, okay, and that student becomes the magnet through which language is learned. The second problem, which you didn't mention, which is very common in ASEAN countries, for example, in classrooms, is the size of the classroom. So you might, it's very common in many of the classrooms to have 100 and 150 students, 200 students. Yeah? Now if the teacher has to follow a curriculum and complete a syllabus, and 200 students are sitting in the classroom doing group work, and you don't have any control over it because you really can't go to every group and find out what is happening, then syllabus completion becomes a major challenge. How do you complete the syllabus? Because the students will have to write an exam, etc., etc. Yeah? This is the second challenge of communicative language teaching. Again, we will see how this can be looked at. The third problem which communicative language teaching also assumes is that, see, the theory comes from a monolingual country. Okay? So it primarily came from the US and the UK. What about classrooms which are highly multilingual? What do you do with the other languages that are there in the classroom? So English might just be one subject in the classroom. The other subjects might be taught in other languages. So how seriously would students take, because they would understand that English as a subject is something that they need to pass, that's all. Okay. So they might not take it very seriously. This is a constant complaint, for example, in colleges of vocational education, for example, engineering colleges. Now students over there have gone to study engineering. English is also a subject. How interested will they be in English? Even if you tell them, oh, you will not be able to survive in the world outside without English, they don't care. Yeah? And how effective, therefore, would communicative language teaching over there would be? So probably audiolingual method will work better because they will need some kinds of English. So what has happened in language teaching methods, especially now, is and we'll talk about this tomorrow, because of the availability of a huge amount of digital materials, okay, students can be redirected towards there. Ah. Okay. So that is another thing that we're going to discuss tomorrow. So what happens with very low resource classrooms? Let me tell you an experiment that happened in Bangladesh. Okay. This started in 2001, and a large number of institutions, including the Open University UK, was involved. Same conditions. So you had low resources in the classroom, low number of teachers. So one teacher for a school, entire school, where the teacher was supposed to teach all the subjects, including English. And so what they did was they recorded things on, in those days, of course, analog videos, and then they transmitted this through BBC Bangla. So there was this channel called BBC Bangla, it's I think still there. So many of these recordings were shown every Saturday, but the teachers would gather in the municipal school. They were given a TV, and through the TV programs, but also the training programs in those days, remember, were copied onto a disk drive, a pen drive, and they were sent to this particular areas, absolutely rural areas with no resource to internet, etc., along with a trainer, where the trainer would stay for 2 days, and all the local teachers in the local area would gather together and they would do a training program. If you are interested in reading about it, there is a lot of writing on this. I can share that with you. Yeah? So people have experimented, for example, in Africa, using radios, okay, for teaching of English. So how do you address low resource classrooms? So you need to use low resource forms of things. Okay. How do you address no English in the classroom, that the students do not know any English at all? There probably communicative language teaching methods don't work. So in recent times, what we say is it is more of an eclectic method. Okay. So if you just stick to one method, it might not work at all. So you might carry those great ideas of communicative language teaching, and then you go to a situation where it's not going to work at all. The students getting into groups are not going to talk in English, where students do not have access to any English at all. So maybe we'll have to go back to another form of method, which probably is going to work better. Maybe audiolingual, maybe grammar translation, or maybe devise our own methods of which combines all these three, etc. Okay. So that is what is known as eclecticism. So you use the eclectic method without sticking to one method. Okay, so sorry, this